I hope you guys are ready for another Canon-inspired build, because today we are talking about everyone's favorite tough little ship, the Defiant. I already did a video for TNG-era inspired builds, and while the Defiant is technically a TNG-era ship, it is quite different from most other Starfleet ships. One of the main differences being that it uses cannons rather than beams. So let's go take a look at how different that's actually going to be. Now, for the Defiant, you currently have two options for your choice of ship. I'm using the Legendary Defiant, but I'll go over how to adapt this build for the normal C-Store Defiant in the additional notes section of the video in case you don't have the Legendary version. The Defiant is going to be a bit different from most of my other Canon builds for Starfleet ships, largely because it focuses around cannons rather than beams. This first cannon I have equipped is the Phaser Quad Cannon, which you can get off the Tier 4 Defiant, or from the Legendary version. I'm using this one for a couple reasons. One, this is the only weapon in the game that has the authentic cannon sounds that the Defiant uses in Deep Space Nine. Sadly, it is a unique weapon, meaning you can only equip one. It's also a rather powerful cannon because it draws power from both your weapon subsystem and your engine subsystem. And lastly, this weapon is also part of the Defiant's console set, but I'll get to more on that in a bit. The other cannons are just dual cannons. I'm using Agony Phasers because they have a better proc, but standard phasers will do just fine if you don't have those. Normally I use dual heavy cannons for cannon scatter volley builds like this, because they have an innate buff to crit severity, but normal dual cannons look a bit more authentic to the show. At least they do in my opinion. If you'd rather go with the dual heavy cannons for the sake of DPS, that's up to you. You also may have noticed I didn't include the Terran Task Force Phaser. Again, that's a heavy cannon, so I didn't think that really fit the theme. And its graphics are a bit darker than standard phasers. It's noticeable enough to me that I felt it broke the theme, but if you want to include it for the sake of your DPS, again, that's up to you. And lastly, I'm using a standard quantum torpedo in the front because, well, the Defiant had quantum torpedoes. Technically, this is actually the wide-angle quantum torpedo. They look the same as standard quantum torpedoes, but this one will have a 180-degree firing arc. Though really, I would probably be better off with a normal quantum torpedo, because that arc mod is taking up room for a damage or crit D mod. And I really don't need the wider firing arc because this is a cannon build, so most of my DPS is already very forward-facing. I'm only using the wide angle here because I didn't feel like upgrading another torpedo. Down here is, for the most part, my usual setup for energy weapon builds. The Colony Deflector for the buffs to crit chance and crit severity, the Competitive Reputation engine for the speed buffs. For the warp core, I decided to use one from the Spire Fleet Holding. Normally I use Deuterium Surplus warp core for its reduction to weapons power cost, but getting one of those cores with decent mods on it can be a pain in the butt because they are a random drop. This warp core is much easier to get because it's available at the Fleet Spire Holding. It has nearly as much weapons power cost and power transfer rate, but also has the AMP mod, which will give plus 3.3% all damage for every subsystem I have over 75, which is actually pretty easy for me on an engineering character. It's only a Cat 1 buff, so it's not super crazy, but in the end, a damage buff is a damage buff. There are multiple different cores available at the Fleet Spire, just make sure you get the one with weapons cap and AMP on it, because you cannot re-engineer these warp cores. And for the shields, I'm using the Discovery Reputation shields for their damage buff against enemy shields. In the aft weapons is an Agony turret, because I'm using all Agony phasers. Again, if you don't feel like buying Agony phasers, you can get by with standard phasers. The other two are the Trilithium turret and Omni Beam from the episode Beyond the Nexus. The Trilithium weapons have a unique proc on them that allows them to grant a small haste buff. Those buffs won't stack, but having both will give me two separate chances for that buff. You might be thinking that having an Omni Beam on this build might be kinda weird, but it's actually not. One, we've actually seen the Defiant use a phaser beam before. Well, technically it was the Mirror Defiant, but still. And having an Omni Beam on here gives me an excuse to use Beam Overload. Beam Overload isn't a huge buff in this case because I've only got the one beam, but it's better than some of the other Bridge Officer ability options. Next are my usual devices for an energy weapon build. Energy Amplifier for the bonus damage to my energy weapons, Deuterium Surplus for the speed buff, Reactive Armor Catalyst in case I need a heal, and Kobayashi Maru Transponder for the random buffs. In the consoles, first we have Lorca's Custom Fire Control. This is from the Discovery Reputation, and it's here for its buffs to crit chance, weapons power, and shield penetration. Sadly, I won't be getting anything out of its set bonuses because I'm not using any of the other pieces, but this is still a good console to use even on its own. Next is the famous DPRM from the Atlas Prototype Dreadnought. This one should be pretty obvious. I'm using this console for its click ability's massive buff to bonus damage, and the hull regen buff can be really nice for a panic button. And right next to it is the Domino from the Bajoran Interceptor, for its buffs to bonus damage and firing cycle haste. I've also got my usual Lobi consoles, Bioneural Infusion Circuits because it has the highest crit severity buff in the game, and Tachyokinetic Converter for its buffs to crit chance and crit severity. I know these consoles aren't exactly cheap, so not every one of you is going to have access to them. If you want some ideas for alternative consoles, I would suggest going back to my Canon TNG-era build video, where I go over that in the additional notes section of that video. The next two are actually from the Defiant's console set. The first is the cloaking device from the Tier 5 Defiant retrofit. This console is pretty self-explanatory, it gives the ship a cloaking device. Normally I wouldn't use this console because, frankly, it's not very good. A cloaking device can be a useful tool for DPS, but sacrificing a whole console slot is a bit much for one. But the Defiant had a cloaking device in the show, so obviously we're going to be using it for this Canon-inspired build. Fortunately, this cloak does get better if you're using the whole console set. But before I get to the set bonuses, let's talk about the other console first. Quantum Warhead Module. What this console does is fire a number of quantum torpedoes at a single target. The number of torpedoes it'll fire will depend on how many stacks this console has built up. It can hold a maximum of 6 charges, and can fire up to 5 torpedoes all at once. Now, this console, along with the cloaking device and the quad cannons, have a set bonus. The 2-piece lowers the cooldown of the cloaking device by 20%, and gives some additional crit chance and crit severity after you decloak for a brief duration, and the 3-piece bonus turns the cloaking device into a full-fledged battle cloak, meaning you'll be able to activate it while you're still in combat. That 3-piece bonus is a large part of the reason why I wanted to use the full set, because if I'm going to be stuck with this cloaking device console, it may as well be a battle cloak, so I can actually get some real use out of it. And to wrap up the consoles, in the tactical slots we've got just a bunch of vulnerability locators, which are here to buff my phaser damage and my crit chance. These also come from the Spire fleet holding. For my captain specializations, I am using my usual energy weapon setup, so that's Intel Officer to gain access to space flanking, which will give me bonus damage when firing on an enemy's rear arc, and Temporal Operative as my secondary to gain access to Entropic Rider, which gives a chance for some extra damage over time with my weapons fire. And now for the personal traits. First we have Adaptive Offense, which is a crit chance buff that turns into a crit severity buff and then back. Context is for Kings for the bonus damage buff for as long as I'm not getting shot at. Fleet Coordinator for the bonus damage buff based on my team size. Fragment of AI Tech for the buff to my energy weapons damage based on my control expertise. Innocuous for the small buff to crit severity and the reduced threat generation. Inspirational Leader for the chance at a stacking buff to buff most of my starship skills. Intel Agent Attaché to reduce the cooldown of my captain's abilities every time I score a critical hit. Fresh from R&R to reduce the minimal cooldown of all Team Bridge Officer abilities. More on why I'm using this in a bit. Terran Targeting Systems for the buff to crit severity. Unconventional Systems to help reduce the cooldown of my Universal consoles. And the Boimler Effect to help with my Bridge Officer cooldowns. Yes, I know Boimler Effect is rather expensive, being a low-buy-store purchase, so I will go over how to set up an Ox to Bat build in the additional notes section of the video. In the Starship traits, I went a little more budget-focused than I had originally intended to. I originally had Universal Designs and Ruin of Our Enemies in this, but then I remembered those are 2 very expensive traits and I figured more people would appreciate this kind of setup. So, first we have Emergency Weapon Cycle off of the Arbiter. This is here to lower my weapons power cost and buff my firing cycle haste. Overpowered and Overgun, from this ship, the Legendary Defiant, is here because it does pretty much the same thing, it just has a different trigger. Strike from Shadows is from the Shran Pilot Escort. It gives me a small buff to crit chance and bonus damage, and also reduces my threat generation. Synthetic Good Fortune off of the Tier 6 Equinox. Anytime I use a control or pilot ability, I gain +5 to control expertise and plus 0.5% to critical chance, both of which stack up to 40 times and will last for 5 minutes. This is the trait that has really revolutionized pilot seating, and I'll go over why in a bit. Next is Promise of Ferocity off the Andorian Thousand Pilot Escort. Anytime I activate a tactical or pilot ability, I gain a small stack of bonus damage. This can trigger once every 4 seconds and can stack up to 5 times. And finally, Withering Barrage, which comes off of the normal Tier 6 Defiant. So if you have the Legendary, you'll have this too. This is here to extend the duration of Cannon Scatter Volley by 4 seconds. Entwined Tactical Matrices would also make a good substitute. However, if you're using Rapid Fire, you're going to need Go for the Kill, which comes off of either of the Jem'Hadar Recon ships. Sadly, these are both promo ships, so they are rather difficult to get. For the sake of a budget, I would recommend sticking to Cannon Scatter Volley. In the Space Reputation traits, first I'm using Advanced Targeting Systems for the buff to crit severity, Precision for the buff to crit chance, Tyler's Duality also for crit chance, Magnified Firepower for the bonus damage to my weapons, and Controlled Countermeasures for the bonus damage buff against enemies that are under the influence of control effects. And now for the Bridge Officer seating. First thing you'll probably notice is that I am using 2 different seats of Pilot Team. What Pilot Team does is give me a buff to my speed and my turn rate, but that's not why I'm using them. Remember Fresh from R&R and Synthetic Good Fortune? That first one is reducing the shared cooldown of these 2 seats of Pilot Team, so I can spam them that much more often. Which is nice because that way I can generate stacks of Synthetic Good Fortune that much faster. The faster I can build up Synthetic Good Fortune, the faster I can build up its crit severity buff. Remember, that stacks up to 40 times, so it's going to take a bit to get the most out of it. And with this setup, I can get it that much quicker. Now for the rest of the abilities, Beam Overload 2 to buff that Omni Beam, Attack Pattern Beta for the debuff, Attack Pattern Omega for its bonus damage buff, Scatter Volley 3 to buff my cannons, Chemosite Lace Weaponry to get some radiation damage with my weapons, Torpedo Spread 2 to buff my torpedo, Emergency Power to Engines 1 for the speed buff, Emit Unstable Warp Bubble because this will trigger unconventional systems, Emergency Power to Weapons 3 because it is a bonus damage buff to my energy weapons, and it triggers Emergency Weapon Cycle. And Jam Sensors 1 and Tractor Beam 2 because they also trigger unconventional systems. In the duty officers, first we have 27 of 47 for the crit severity buff, an energy weapon officer that can give me a buff to shield penetration every time I use beam overload. That shield pen will apply to all of my weapons, not just the beam. It just triggers off of beam overload. 3 projectile officers that can buff my crit chance or severity every time I fire a torpedo. And 40 of 47, who will give me a chance to reduce my pilot seating abilities every time I use a tactical ability, and vice versa. Okay, 2 additional things to cover. First off, an Aux to Bat build, because Boimler Effect and these Borg duty officers are pretty expensive. This is pretty easy. First, just swap out 40 of 47 and 2 of the other duty officers to make room for your technicians. Then you need to make room for Aux to Bat. So trade out Emit Unstable Warp Bubble for one of them, and you can either move emergency power to weapons down to the ensign seat and put your second Aux to Bat there, or you can put an engineer in this universal seat and put your second Aux to Bat there. This would mean you'd have to get rid of beam overload or one of your other tactical abilities. And the other thing to talk about, how to set this up on the normal C-Store version or the Fleet version of the Defiant. Fortunately, the C-Store version is very similar to the Legendary version. The only real differences are a slight difference in the bridge officer seating, the C-Store version isn't a full pilot ship so it won't have pilot maneuvers, and the C-Store version isn't a warship, so you'll have an experimental weapon slot instead of an 8th weapon slot. The C-Store version only has 1 pilot seat, which is on the Lieutenant Commander tactical seat, so you'll have to use pilot maneuvers 1 and 2 instead of 2 seats of 1. The engineering seat on the C-Store version only goes up to Lieutenant, so you'll probably have to use that universal seat as an engineering seat to have room for Aux to Bat. The biggest issue is going to be the experimental weapon, because you never see the Defiant use an experimental weapon in the show, so finding one that's theme appropriate isn't going to be easy. The best you're going to have to do is something that isn't too graphically intense. I always recommend Soliton Wave Impeller because it is one of the best ones for DPS, and in this case it's pretty useful too because it's not super flashy graphics wise. But I don't own every experimental weapon in the game, so I can't tell you what every single one of them looks like. If anyone knows of an experimental weapon that would be visually appropriate for a Canon style build for the Defiant, please feel free to comment down below. Fun fact, I almost forgot to record the voiceover for this section of the video. I've been doing so many guide videos these days, I almost completely forgot about the Parse. Anyway, 323k DPS in an ISE. That is actually much better than I expected this build to do. Like, I was expecting something in the 200 to 250k range, so I am very happy with how this came out. So yeah, that is my Canon-inspired build for the Defiant. I'm still torn on what Canon-inspired build to do next, either the TMP era or the TOS era. I think I'll do a community poll to see which one you guys want to see more, so keep an eye out for that. Of course, that probably won't happen for a bit because I've still got to do another video for the Useful Traits series, and that'll probably get interrupted when we finally get stats for the new Mirror Bundle ships, because you know I'm going to want to do a video on those. So yeah, that should give you an idea on what's to come. Anyway, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. I know it's tedious to hear every time, but it really does help the channel and I do appreciate it. My name's Stu, and I'll see you guys next time.